Welcome back to The Proof. Today we're kicking off a special two-part conversation on one of the biggest drivers of disease worldwide today, and that is high blood pressure. To help us unpack this, I'm joined by Dr. Raymond Townsend, a nephrologist and hypertension specialist from the University of Pennsylvania, widely recognized as one of the world's leading authorities in this field. In this first part of our conversation, we go deep into the fundamentals of blood pressure. We'll explore the underlying pathology of hypertension or significantly elevated blood pressure, why atherosclerosis clusters at certain points in the arterial system, the role of arterial stiffness in blood pressure, including the critical role of elastin, why a lower resting heart rate may be beneficial for blood pressure, and how blood pressure affects kidney health. We'll also cover how many people are unknowingly living today with high blood pressure, how to measure it properly, and what ideal readings actually look like. If you've ever wondered why blood pressure is such a big deal, I think you'll find this episode tremendously helpful. Please enjoy. Before we dive into the details, can you share a little bit about your background so the audience kind of knows a little bit about you, how you came to focus your career on hypertension and what your role is at Penn today?
I've been through training programs in internal medicine and nephrology. So that's 5 years of my life beyond medical school. When I was a resident, I had so many patients with hypertension, which was unusual at the time, that I formed my own hypertension clinic so that once a month I could focus on that particular problem. When I was a kidney fellow in nephrology at Temple University here in Philadelphia, high blood pressure in North Philadelphia is rampant. So it just sharpened the focus a little bit more. And then after finishing fellowship and practicing, mostly at academic medical centers, it tends to be the case that the difficult hypertensives are often sent to kidney docs, sometimes to cardiology, but often to kidney docs like myself. So I worked on not only getting better as best I could at patient care, but also research. So I have a mix of research and patient care in my background. Nothing about hypertension, glowed, except that, like most people, I had a wonderful mentor when I was a third-year resident, a guy named Don DePetty, who's still alive. He's at the University of South Carolina at Columbia now. And he just charmed me into, this is a career you should consider. So the combination of mentorship and opportunity. And here I am 40 plus years later.
Well, so if you look back over those 40 years that you've been in this field, on the clinical side and then also the research side, what would you say are your biggest takeaways, the key highlights that maybe have changed how we think about hypertension along the way?
So I was told a long time ago that a good memory is a real aid, a help to people who practice medicine. And so I kind of remember a lot of the different presentations, and every patient is their own story. It's not like you're, a cookbook approach to unraveling what's happening in a patient. You really have to go through their story. And a lot of them come with, a deep breath. And then they're like, I don't know how much your time you have for me. And I'm like, forget about the time constraints. Just tell me your story. And I would prompt them with different things. Over the years, because I work at the University of Pennsylvania and have been there since 1993, the things that we have seen at a place like Penn are just really incredible. We have a program, for example, that does tumors that secrete adrenaline or noradrenaline. In the US each year, there's about 800 to 1,000 new cases of this. We see 40 of them at our institution. When you think about it, one medical school out of 100, and we're seeing 40 out of 1,000 of the new cases of this kind of thing because we have good genetics, and I've learned from the geneticists. We have good surgery. We have great laparoscopic surgical support. We have good biochemical help with the labs and people that understand these sorts of things. And if anything, the my takeaway is that the more you have an opportunity to practice in a place where learning is cherished and you have the opportunity through your patient mix to really, confuse and confound your colleagues with the different presentations and the different stories that are involved, it really has been satisfying. I don't hold up a plaque that says, I can cure your blood pressure, but I can usually lower it, and sometimes even to the current target blood pressure, if given the time and your willingness to put up with the things that I recommend. But it's been humbling too, Simon, because sometimes some patients come and there's just not a whole lot I can do for them. So I've learned that there's such a mix, such a spectrum of people out there that, you sort of start with, let's begin over, especially when someone comes after seeing like 20 doctors and they're just still crazy uncontrolled for their blood pressure. And like my partner, Debbie Cohen, always says, sometimes you just have to stop some of the stuff that they're already on because it isn't working anyway and begin over again. And that's always been, I think, a bit of good advice when it comes to managing the complicated hypertensive patient.
What's the biggest difference or differences between how you thought about blood pressure when you were, say, late 20s, 30, and how you think about blood pressure today?
Yeah, great question. When I was young, I thought of blood pressure as a problem. So, like most things, problems have solutions. It's my job to apply the right solution here to get that number, those para numbers, down to an acceptable level. And I kind of approached high blood pressure care as really a problem-solving procedure where I have a certain, age, gender, ethnicity, body mass composition, kidney function, a couple other variables that you plug in your head. And then you apply the algorithms that are out there through guidelines or, consensus statements from societies and things like that. And so I would aim at that number there. And, patient be darned, I want to get to that number. As you live, as you've had patients that have had adverse experiences with the medications that you so righteously prescribed in the interests of getting them to their goal blood pressure, you kind of learn that, not everybody is the same as everybody else. And sometimes empathy is just as valuable as medications in getting people to conquer the biggest hurdle we have in hypertension care, which is taking the medications. If people were adherent, 100% adherent, we would have a lot better control of blood pressure in our population in the U.S. than we currently have. And the problem with adherence often is that patients are not convinced that you really have their best interests at heart here. So that's the other thing I've learned. And I learned this from my nurse practitioner, Ginny Ford. She did a PhD at Penn for a nurse practitioner and a nursing PhD. And she looked into why patients take their blood pressure medicines or don't take their blood pressure medicines. And like most PhD theses, this is a big, long thing. And at the bottom line, at the end of the day, the thing that mattered most in getting people to take their medication and refill the prescriptions was when they felt that the person prescribing for them cared about them and that this was really in their best interest to do that. And if I learned nothing else in these last 40 years, I kind of understand that you gotta make sure patients understand you care about them more than you care about the numbers or somebody whipping you because your numbers are not quite, all under that current target level of blood pressure.
What a beautiful learning, particularly for any young doctors or doctors in training listening. And it comes back to the story bit that you mentioned before, helping someone feel seen, feel understood, and not just as another data point that you're treating. We're going to dig into high blood pressure and hypertension in this episode and help folks better understand it, what it actually is and what's driving it, and what are the best practice interventions that we have available to us today. So maybe right at the top here, we can define our terms a little bit because hypertension is going to come up quite a bit. When we say hypertension, what exactly do we mean?
The one thing we've learned from many years of observation is that there's no such thing as hypertension. So when we say someone has hypertension or doesn't have hypertension, we're really drawing a line in the sand where no physical line should exist. Because the relationship of blood pressure to outcomes, whether it's heart attacks, stroke, heart failure, kidney disease, peripheral circulation problems, no matter what it is, the relationship is graded. So the worse your blood pressure, the more likely an outcome. And you have to get way down to an upper number of about 115 in order to feel reasonably safe that blood pressure is unlikely to cause a problem in your next 5 to 10 years compared to your next door neighbor who has maybe 30 points higher than you do on that upper number. But we have an agency, a group. It's called the Joint National Committee, or it's got new names now. It's called the ACC-AHA guideline. And it really isn't just the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association. It is an alphabet soup. And I just made this comment last week, and I think it's true. Any group that has an A, when you abbreviate their, USNA, they're likely on the current hypertension guidelines because ACC, AHA, APNC, ASPC, and on it goes. And there's like 10 or 12 agencies that are involved here. They write a guideline and they tell us what the current definition for hypertension is. So you have to divide normal from elevated but not quite hypertensive to really hypertensive, and dang, you better do something about it. Right now, the current definition for hypertension is when your upper number is 130 or higher, or your lower number is 80 or higher. So that's the actual definition. We used to stage it so that you'd say, okay, this is bad, this is really bad, and this is, oh my gosh, have you read your life insurance policy recently to make sure your premiums are paid and that when you die shortly from this level of blood pressure, your next of kin is going to be rewarded for that. We have lost most of the staging aspect. We now say that there's only stage 1 and stage 2 hypertension. Stage 1 is 130 to 139 or 80 to 89. Stage 2 is 140 over 90 and everything above that. So that's where our current definitions lie. And there's some semantics that we have about numbers that are lower than that, but those are the business ends. 130 seems to be our universal definition for the upper number and 80 for the lower number.
And those numbers are speaking to the pressure that blood is exerting on the wall of the blood vessel?
Yeah, so it's an interesting physiology conundrum. What the body cares about is flow. We don't measure flow. So how does flow happen? Flow happens because we have an intermittent pump called the heart that generates the flow. And it generates this flow by squeezing periodically, like 1 time a second, 60 times a minute, maybe 70, and in a less, healthy individual, 80 or 90 beats per minute. And every time the heart beats, it throws out about 2.5 ounces of blood into the big artery, the aorta. The aorta has to expand to handle that. And so that pressure that pushes the blood out of the heart into the aorta is the upper number. And then as the aorta squeezes down back to its original state before the next heartbeat happens, it delivers blood to the periphery. And then the level at which it stops doing that in the next systolic bolus, blob, 2.5 ounces of blood comes out, that starts the cycle over again. So the upper number is the peak pressure we see at each cycle. The lower number is the nadir, or the lower number we see in each cycle. When we are really clever, we have a thing called the mean arterial pressure. That's what's often used in science, like animals like rats and mice and kangaroos and rabbits and other animal models. They're interested in what happens to the mean arterial pressure because that gives you a sense of what the systems feel overall. And so the mean arterial pressure is somewhere between that upper and lower, generally more closer to the lower than the upper number. But those excursions in pressure around the mean pressure are what we typically see when we have a cuff put on our arm, is squeezed up either electrically or by a human pump, hand grip, and then we listen or the machine records the pulsatility in the cuff itself, spits out 2 numbers, really good devices will spit out three numbers: the systolic, diastolic, and the mean arterial pressure. You would think heredity would play a big role. About 30 to 40% of hypertension we can map to family history or genes, and no single gene by and large. Rare cases of single genes, sure, and they're almost always centered about how the body handles salt. But by and large, most people do not have a single gene defect. Otherwise, we could try and fix it at some point that elevates their blood pressure. So part of it's heredity, but it's not the majority.
I'm sure you've heard of Gymshark. It is one of the biggest fitness brands in the world today. And it all started in a teenager's garage. Yep, that's right. Ben Francis was 19 years old, printing shirts himself, and he built it all on Shopify. That's what I love most about Shopify. It gives everyday people the tools to turn an idea into something real. And if you align it with something that you believe adds value to the world, it won't feel like work at all. And I can tell you honestly, that's exactly how I feel about building 38 Terra with Dr. Will Bolsowitz, bringing a truly science-backed gut health product to life. Whether you're starting a supplement line, a sustainable clothing brand, or any kind of physical goods business, Shopify gives you everything you need. Beautiful storefronts, secure payments, and AI tools to help write product descriptions and generate discount codes. And their 24/7 support is actually very helpful. Shopify powers millions, and I mean millions of businesses worldwide, including 38 Terras. If you've got a dream, allow Shopify to help bring it to life. Start your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/proof. That's shopify.com/proof. What's the problem, if you were to kind of simplify this, and then we could perhaps double click on it, but what's the problem, the downstream consequences of that pressure going up above, say the top number above 115, which I think you kind of said was optimal and you'd be at a low risk of complications over the next 5 years?
Okay, so complication number one is that if the heart is generating the pressure, and you now tell it, I want you to generate that pressure at a higher number, you're like back to the Israelites working for Egypt and Pharaoh saying, no more straw, get your own straw. So now they have to work harder in order to make that same brick. In an analogous fashion, the heart has to pump that 2.5 ounces of blood, no matter what the pressure is, in order to feed the needs of the body. If you raise the bar, so to speak, by raising the numbers, and there's a bunch of reasons why the numbers go up, then the heart has to accommodate that. And if you raise it further because of problems with hardening of the arteries and narrowing of the lumen to the coronaries and the other things, then you reach a point where the heart says, okay, enough's enough, I can't do this anymore, and it starts to expand and fail. And when that happens, you get one of the complications of high blood pressure, which right now is becoming right near the top of the list for hypertension, and that is heart failure. So when the heart can't meet the needs of the body in terms of the amount of blood necessary to pump there to provide nutrients and remove wastes, you will have heart failure. The other two organs are the brain and the kidney. Think about this. When you're sitting like we are right now, your brain is above your heart. And technically speaking, like any column of fluid, the pressure falls as you go north here. So sitting here, even though the pressure may be 100 here, it drops a little bit as you go up. So the brain has to be clever. And the circulation of the brain is made in such a way that it's able to dilate, and dilate dramatically, in order to allow blood to flow easily uphill and through the tissues of the brain. When you raise the blood pressure, the brain has the ability to squeeze down the vessels to prevent that extra flow, but that doesn't work perfectly, and you can overcome that by pushing hard enough with the blood pressure to the point where the brain says, oh my gosh, this flow is just killing me, and you develop a problem called encephalopathy. It used to be very common back in the 70s and 80s, especially, that people would present with this hypertensive encephalopathy because the drugs weren't so good back then. Drugs are much better now. We don't see as much of it. It still occurs once in a while. But the problem with the brain is twofold. Number one, it can't stand it when the pressure goes up for a long period of time because it has an essentially low resistance to blood flow to make sure it can get blood with each heartbeat. And it occasionally bleeds. And so about 1/20th, 1/10, about 5 to 10% of the strokes we see are what were called hemorrhages, cerebral hemorrhage, cerebellar hemorrhage, different parts of the brain. How those happen is that over time, the elevated pressure is like an old-fashioned tire with an inner tube and a little pop, an aneurysm that fits on the outside, a bubble, and then that bubble pops. And that bubble, when it pops, lets blood start pumping into the brain. The brain's in a fixed circumstance. The cage of the skull keeps you from expanding. So if blood gets in there, brain has to push down and mash together. So cerebral or cerebellar hemorrhage is a bad thing because blood is now where brain tissue used to be, and you've now squished that, and it's not always easy and sometimes not possible to remove the blood clot and let the brain re-expand again. The more common form is when the blood vessels between the pressure and the use of cigarettes and the presence of diabetes and other stuff causes the lumen, the inner lining of the blood vessel, to narrow with time. And when that narrowing hits a certain critical point, and either your platelets or some other part of your coagulation blocks it, or the pressure falls for one reason or another, and that, you're hanging on by a thread there, you drop the pressure and the thread collapses, now you have an area of brain that isn't getting blood at all. So that's an infarction of the brain, or what's called a typical stroke. And those are the lion's share of most of the strokes that we see. For the kidneys are down below the heart, so they actually see a high, when we're sitting and standing, they see a higher level of pressure than what you measure in the arm. And so they're adjusting as well. And they have a very fine-tuned circulation that kind of prevents that high pressure head from getting to the little filter units. You have 1 million filter units in each kidney, and they're defended by this apparatus called the preglomerular vasculature. But diabetes, Black American race, obesity, these things affect the ability of that preglomerular vasculature to fight off that high pressure. And consequently, the pressure wave gets to the kidney and it damages these delicate filter units and causes functional loss. So the brain stroke is the thing we see. With the kidneys, it's kidney failure, kidney insufficiency or kidney failure. And for the heart, it's two things. It's heart failure, but also because the heart has a circulation with it, the narrowing of the coronaries occurs. Last point to make, Simon, is that one of the things people don't usually think about is that when the heart is squeezing, there's virtually no flow in the heart. So the heart has to get all of its blood flow during the time that it relaxes before it squeezes again. Roughly 1/3 of the time in a cardiac cycle is spent squeezing, and 2/3 of the time is spent relaxing. But 3/3 of the flow has to occur during the 2/3 of the time it's relaxing. So when you have narrowing, and you have a restriction of flow, and you add pressure, in other words, more bricks, no straw, now I need more sugar, I need more oxygen, I need more fatty acid, and I got a constriction to the flow. That leads to coronary disease symptoms, and ultimately, because most things progress, ultimately a heart attack, which is a blockage in the coronary artery. Those are the 4 biggest complications we see from high blood pressure.
On the coronary artery blockage that you just spoke to there, is high blood pressure making those coronary arteries more susceptible to atherosclerosis, like the lipoproteins going in and getting stuck and then kickstarting the inflammatory cascade? Or is high blood pressure just making those kind of blockages or narrowings more vulnerable to sort of breaking off and then causing an issue?
It's actually all of the above. There's 2 processes that happen in arteries that have names on them, like coronary or radial or femoral or aorta. One is a change in the wall. So the wall of an artery, coronary included, is vascular smooth muscle. And smooth muscle responds to the pressure like any muscle. You put 20-pound weights in my arms, make me do this 1,000 times a day, and these muscles are going to get a little bigger. When you throw higher level of pressure at the vascular smooth muscle in the coronary and anywhere else, the vessels tend to hypertrophy. They get a little thicker, juicier, and consequently, you got something we call arteriosclerosis. That's not athero. Athero is soft. Arterio is firm, like muscle. So arteriosclerosis occurs in part because of the pressure. But athero happens at the same time, often because of lipids, high cholesterol, high triglyceride, low HDL cholesterol, usage of cigarettes, presence of things like diabetes or congenital disorders that affect the lining of the vessels. And high blood pressure is like mixing a little bit of gasoline into that fire that burns for other reasons, where lipids, fats accumulate in the wall of things like the coronary arteries. So blood pressure is clearly a component in that. But one of the things we found in a study called Mr. Fit, the Multiple Risk Factor Intervention Trial, is that although we know high blood pressure is associated with more coronary artery disease, lowering blood pressure and looking at the benefits of lowering blood pressure, your biggest benefits are reduction in stroke and reduction in heart failure. Lesser benefit is reduction in death, and least benefit in general is reduction in heart attack. It does happen, but it's not quite as much as you would have thought, given how much a role we think high blood pressure has in contributing to narrowing of the coronary arteries in the first place, which tells me that there's more to the coronary artery story than just blood pressure.
Also, on that same line of thinking there, that something I've always thought about is, what is it about the specific areas of the coronary arteries that seem to be susceptible to atherosclerosis? Why do you tend to see this buildup of plaque in those areas versus other parts of the arterial system? And I've heard others speculate that maybe that is because at those kind of bifurcations or certain sections of the coronary arteries, there is a difference in blood flow.
There's a ton of speculation. I won't tell you that there's a lot of known fact to explain what you just asked. For example, it's very uncommon to see atherosclerosis here in the forearm, in the arm or the upper arm. But it's not uncommon to see it in the coronaries or the carotids, less so in the kidney arteries, but definitely in the aorta, and it accumulates with age. So when you have injury to the lining of blood vessels and it repairs, it doesn't repair perfectly over time. So it tends to be a cumulative phenomenon. But we found back in the 50s, after the Korean War, that when autopsies were done on some of the soldiers that died in the Korean War, they were finding fatty streaks in their aorta at the age of 20. So atherosclerosis is a lifetime of accumulation of the fats. Why the coronaries are so singled out is, number one, we have a symptom called angina. That helps. Coronaries are, their lumens are 2-3 millimeters in the first place. So when you narrow that 50%, even though there's a phenomenon called the Glegov, from Cyrus Glegov, I think he's at Ann Arbor years ago, described this as the coronaries are narrowed from atherosclerosis. The vascular smooth muscle tries to dilate a little bit to accommodate for the loss of the lining, but there's a limit to how much that can happen. And when that stops accommodating or acting as a compensatory mechanism and the lining still gets clogged, then you begin to see things, especially with effort. So angina is often effort related with, shoveling snow, walking steps, jogging, or whatever. And so that's part of it. The other thing is that unlike most organs in the body, your coronary arteries are doing this. Every time the heart beats, they're kind of moved a lot. So they're in motion a lot. And there's a whole field of medicine called fluid dynamics that looks at the nature of blood flow and this phenomenon called shearing force and the endothelium, the lining of the blood vessel. So there's a single layer of cells on the innermost part between the vessel itself and the blood flowing in it called the endothelium. And the endothelium is a is a powerhouse of stuff happening all the time. And it makes factors that kind of try and keep the vascular smooth muscle right behind it happy and, sort of relaxed, not constricted. So it makes these relaxing factors. Nobel Prize was awarded for the discovery of one of those factors called nitric oxide years ago. And so it's always making nitric oxide, but the amount of nitric oxide it makes is partially shear dependent, partially flow dependent, pressure, etc. And so parts of it are good at that, parts are not so good. And we know that when the endothelium is dysfunctional, when endothelial dysfunction is present, coronary disease is more common. And the accumulation of lipids happens in those folks and generates coronary athero.
Okay, so summarizing a little bit of where we're up to now, you said as that top number or even bottom number on the blood pressure reading goes up, it increases our risk of kind of downstream health consequences like heart failure, like kidney disease, like having a hemorrhage in the brain or an infarction in the brain or a blockage/infarction in the heart. And you mentioned that there is a bunch of reasons why those numbers can go up. How would you summarize what those main reasons are that would drive the blood pressure numbers up?
So years ago, we used to say, after all the work that was done, that hypertension is the geneticist's graveyard for their reputation. You would think that something as important as high blood pressure, at the current time, it's at the top of the World Health Organization's list of things that prematurely kill people or damage them so that they live with something called a disability-adjusted life year, or a DALY for short. So heredity, you would think heredity would play a big role. About 30 to 40% of hypertension we can map to family history or genes, and no single gene by and large. Rare cases of single genes, sure, and they're almost always centered about how the body handles salt. But by and large, most people do not have a single gene defect. Otherwise, we could try and fix it at some point that elevates their blood pressure. So part of it's heredity, but it's not the majority. Second thing is that we have what we call exposures over time. The Framingham study showed in the 1960s that the biggest predictor that you could measure for having hypertension later in life was how much you weighed when you were a teenager and a young adult. So people that were heavier were more likely to develop hypertension over time. And right now, that's still probably one of the biggest factors that plays a role in blood pressure elevation is body mass index, however you measure it, whether you use the body mass index, kilograms per meter squared kind of thing, or whether you use a measure of waist circumference and height, doesn't matter. You can tell fat people tend to be fat. People that are kind of big but really muscular, they look a little different. So body weight is an important component. Some portion of the world, we don't really know the exact amount, but some portion of the world, when they eat more salt, their blood pressure is higher. When they eat less salt, their blood pressure is lower. I wish I could tell you what those numbers are. The problem with the whole salt literature, in my opinion, is that we still don't have a definition of what salt-sensitive hypertension is. How many millimeters change does there have to be in the numbers on how much milliequivalents or milligrams of sodium that equals a salt-sensitive hypertensive? And there's numbers 3, 5, 10, all sorts of things bandied about out there. So we still have a little bit of definitional problem there. But most people agree that salt intake is another aspect that raises blood pressure. The circulation likes to be exercised. So the ability to adapt to needs, especially skeletal muscle needs, which is a huge area where blood can go. When you exercise, your cardiac output, how much blood your heart beats per minute, that can increase 4 to 6 fold in some people. And it's all going to skeletal muscle. And it's going there to rinse away the products of skeletal muscle activity like lactic acid and carbon dioxide and other things. And it does that in an amazing degree. So physical activity is one of the things that you often find in guidelines as a means to help not only defray the likelihood of developing high blood pressure in the future, but also as a component of the lifestyle approach to managing blood pressure currently. And lastly, Simon, there's a whole sidebar of things that we think are important. potassium deficiency, for example. Most of our American diet, for example, is really high in sodium and really low in potassium. And some people would say it's not the sodium alone, it's the ratio of sodium to potassium that we get in our diet that tends to be the bad thing. So if we elevated the potassium and kept eating our Lay's potato chips, etc., we could probably undo some of the sodium load, but I'm not recommending that as a therapy for managing blood pressure. Lastly, and the current ACC/AHA guidelines have come out in print about this, there is a role for alcohol, but boy, is it, in my mind, terribly hard to distinguish or to tease out what exactly its role in blood pressure is. There is a limit to how much exercise a person should do in the interests of keeping their circulation healthy. It's frequently quoted as saying, God gave us so many heartbeats in life. If you use them up on a treadmill, you probably are not doing a favor making it to your 80th year.
Whether you're training hard or simply aiming to feel your best every day, IM8 Daily Ultimate Essentials has you covered. It's the daily multi-nutrient that I've recently switched to and now recommend. With 92 bioavailable nutrients, including vitamin B12, vitamin D, iodine, choline, K2, CoQ10 for heart health, and MSM for joint recovery. It is NSF certified for sport. It ships to over 30 countries, including the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, and works with both plant-based and omnivorous diets. I've used several multi-nutrients over the years, but IM8's clean formulation and commitment to science and clinical validation really stood out. So much so that I've joined their scientific advisory board alongside Dr. David Katz and Dr. Suzanne Devkota, two previous guests of The Proof. For listeners of The Proof, IM8 is offering 10% off your first Daily Ultimate Essentials order with the code SIMON at checkout. Just head to im8health.com. That's IM, the number 8, HEALTH.com, and use promo code SIMON to get started. I want to step through some of those things a little more, sodium and physical activity. But before we get there, I appreciate that you were mostly going through things that are modifiable, some of the exposures that we can change through our lifestyle choices or modify over time. But in terms of the non-modifiable, if we think about age and sex, is hypertension or high blood pressure something that affects men over the age of 40 more than others? Is there differences between races? How would you summarize that?
So there are, fortunately or unfortunately, the U.S. is such a mix of Hispanic, Black American, White American, and now a growing portion of Asian and South Asian individuals, that there is a difference, men versus women. Women tend to have less because of hormonal protection until menopause, and then they surpass men. Black patients, Black Americans, tend to have more hypertension compared to white. Not a lot. I mean, this isn't like 20% versus 5%. It's like 58% versus 53%. There is always a difference, and it always, unfortunately, penalizes minority populations. That said, Hispanics, for example, have more blood pressure, but often less consequences compared to that same level of blood pressure in a white population, for example. So age affects the upper number throughout the lifespan in the U.S. Age does not affect the diastolic pressure the same way. When you look at what happens to the lower number over time, it peaks during your 50 to 55 year age bracket. Then after 55 or so, it falls. So systolic continues to rise, diastolic falls after 55. That means that the pulse pressure, the difference between the upper and the lower number, widens as you age. And one of the things we think explains that is a change in the pattern that elevates blood pressure. When you're younger, the resistance to blood flow, so how much you have to push in order to get that 2.5 ounces out into the circulation, the diastolic pressure especially tells you that it's a resistance-related thing. The body is just fighting you in terms of every heartbeat. But as you age, we learned this from the airline industry. When you take a wing and you do this to it like 10,000 times a day for like a period of months or so, much like flying an aircraft, certain stress fractures occur in the wing itself. And the same kind of stress fractures occur in the lining, in the wall of the blood vessels. You have these elastin components, especially in the aorta. And as you stretch, release repeatedly, those elastin fragments bust. Tiny bit each time. But that's cumulative because you don't repair elastin after you finish puberty. You got all the elastin you're going to have by the time you're like 15. And so you got to take care of that. And if you don't and you use it up, the body replaces that damaged elastin with a thing called collagen. If you've ever had a steak or some piece of meat that has that gristle component there, which is really hard and tough, that's collagen. And if you think about what happens when that begins to accumulate in your blood vessels, it makes them really hard to blow up with the food. And that's why the systolic pressure gets more and more difficult over time. The nature of pressure shifts from the resistance to the stiffness. And the stiffness is what drives the upper number up and the lower number down after 55. We don't know if that's truly modifiable or not. Clearly, age is not so modifiable. Gender is not so modifiable. Parental history is not so modifiable. Those are the main factors that have a role in blood pressure that we can't fix. The others we can treat to one degree or another.
So that kind of stiffness that you're talking about it's akin to, pumping water through a hose that's kind of malleable versus some sort of steel pipe where the walls are completely fixed. And what you're saying is that stiffness. So what I heard is it seems to track with age as we get older, that elastin is being replaced with collagen. So our arteries have kind of less capacity to expand and then constrict. And we don't understand if there's anything that we can do through our lifestyle to help keep those arteries more malleable.
There's a couple of things that we see when we look at populations years later. And so the things that predict the worst types of stiffness over time are faster heart rates and inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein. You may have heard of HS, it's highly sensitive C-reactive protein. So inflammatory markers are one thing that heal by virtue of scarring in the tissues like the aorta and other places. So inflammatory markers are one thing that predict that over time. And the other just is the number of heartbeats. This is a thing that we kind of say that, when you have a heart rate of 60, it's probably better for you because just think about it. If you're beating 100 beats per minute versus 60 beats per minute, and every beat has a tiny bit of damage that it does, just because it's the cost of doing business with a tissue like the aorta, it's better to be slower than faster. So how does exercise fit into that when you take the heart rate up to 140 while you're jogging along there? And that gets to a question that, this is not a debate. This is an animated discussion that I've had, and some cardiologists are of a similar mind, that there is a limit to how much exercise a person should do in the interests of keeping their circulation healthy. It's I'm frequently quoted as saying, God gave us so many heartbeats in life. If you use them up on a treadmill, you probably are not doing a favor making it to your 80th year. And I don't know what the optimum is, but I think that when you look at what American Heart and ACC and others have suggested in terms of the amount of aerobic heart rate increasing exercise that we do, something like 30 to 60 minutes a day is probably a good thing, because the net effect is to lower the resting heart rate. So you pay a little bit in terms of the increase in heart rate when you're exercising in order to recoup the interest that you get in terms of the lessened heart rate over time through the balance between exercise events.
So you bring it up for about an hour a day, but then you get the benefit over the other 23 hours and your kind of average heart rate is lower than if you were a sedentary person.
And that's the non-cardiologist you have on your show today talking. So I'm sure that the more cardiologically sophisticated would love to take issue with me if there was a Q&A session at the end of this.
I think that's also consistent with many things where taking things to the extreme is not just because something's good doesn't always mean it's good at any dose.
The Stoics were right, in moderation.
Raymond, if a 35-year-old's listening to this podcast right now, and let's say they're fit and healthy, they don't have heart disease or kidney disease, and to their knowledge, last time they went in to see their doctor who did a quick blood pressure test came back normal, and they're thinking, why should I really care about blood pressure today? What would you say to that person?
Couple of things. First thing is that years ago, the architects of the Framingham Heart Study, Bill Cannell and Bill Castelli, were on PBS, the sort of public broadcasting systems, health kind of thing back in the 80s. And they said at the time, there are 4 things every person should know about themselves if they want to do their best to keep their organs functioning. They should know their blood pressure. They should know their blood sugar, their blood cholesterol, and their body weight relative to their height. What's the ideal? Trying to keep those things as close to the population healthy norm that you can is probably your best hedge. What you can do, modifiable things that you can do in order to extend the likelihood that you'll live longer. One of the scariest things, I think, and maybe some of your listeners have had this experience, is to have a patient, a family member, who has developed dementia. One of the funky things about dementia, especially Alzheimer's, but other dementias, and there are a series of them, vascular dementias, frontotemporal dementias, they have an incipient phase. And we think, Rotterdam study and other things have shown this, that when your pressure is high in your middle-aged years, your 40 to 60 time period, even modest elevations of blood pressure during that time period, the price you pay ultimately is a premature loss of functioning neurons when you hit your 60s and 70s and 70-ish to 80. So one of the precursors for dementia, not uncommonly, is a blood pressure difficult to control in the middle-aged years. I would tell your 35-year-old that, hey, that's great, but like most things, it needs attention to detail, because as we age, that upper number continues to go up, and that happens pretty much generally in our American population. Nothing I know prevents that. There are slopes, so some are really fast at how far they, and others are not so fast in how far they rise in a period of time. But keeping at ideal body weight and working on blood pressure, I think that's an investment that really does pay off. And the exercise people will tell you there's a little bit of endorphin that gets released, sort of the brain's morphine type effect that happens when you exercise. And it doesn't take, a marathon, a 26-mile race in order to get that. It happens even with 30 to 45 minutes of good physical activity, taken at least 3, but hopefully 6 or 7 times a week.
And you mentioned at the top the importance of adherence, because we could make a significant dent in terms of treating elevated blood pressure and reducing the risk of all of these things that we've spoken about if we could increase adherence to blood pressure lowering medications. But the other thing that I hear that I think is similar to this is that nearly half of adults in the United States, if I'm correct, with hypertension don't know they have it, which gets me thinking about underdiagnosis and if that statistic is accurate and what is the solution there.
So the awareness issue, no matter what percentage you put on it, is always a consideration. It used to be 50% back when the first hypertension awareness programs were initiated in the 70s and early 80s. Currently, it's probably less because a lot of people, you can't escape it. You go to your primary care doc, first thing they do is take your blood pressure. You go to your dentist, they take their blood pressure. You go to your GYN, they don't usually take, well, some do, but many don't. If you're pregnant, however, they will. A lot of people have had a friend with a blood pressure device, or they've been to CVS or some other place, they stuck their arm in. It's really hard in this day and age. it's really almost inexcusable in this day and age to not know if you have high blood pressure. And the efforts that have been made, particularly in the Black American community, where if you go to a barbershop, if you go to a church, if you go to a store, there's often a do-gooder on the side there that's willing to check your blood pressure just to, as a courtesy, as a public health type of service. So because Black Americans are so sensitive to the effects of blood pressure and more vulnerable, especially to the heart complications and the kidney complications of blood pressure. It's a population we have labored over the last 40 years to really hone in on and make sure that awareness is not the reason, that a lack of awareness is not the reason that they're, going to experience a target organ damage event in the future. So I don't know what the true number is currently because there's so many people looking into it. You've got the CDC looking into it, Million Hearts program looking into it, the National Health and Nutrition Exam Surveys looking into it. My gut feeling is that it's somewhere in the range of 20 to 30%, not 50 the way it used to be, but certainly not zero. And the other thing, Simon, is that many people are diagnosed at like 120 to 129. And the current guidelines don't call that normal. They call that elevated. We had a problem with the semantics here like forever. When that pre-hypertension blood pressure range was first introduced back in around the year 2000 or so, we called it pre-hypertension back then, and people pitched a fit. What the devil is that? What are you doing? Why are you making this more difficult? Now you're giving people a label, and people are going to freak out when you label them as pre-hypertensive. They're going to miss work, and they're going to need, Valium or something like that to calm them down about that. So with the current availability of blood pressure devices and, clinics, healthcare, and our emphasis on get the numbers checked, it's less common now, I believe, than it has been in years gone by. But it's like anything. I use this slide a lot when I talk to medical groups about blood pressure awareness and control. And it's a guy named Peter Drucker years ago said, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. It's a solid finance principle. If you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And the same is true in blood pressures, as it is in hedge funds and other things.
How do you recommend people measure their blood pressure throughout their life? Like, is it enough to just go and check it once or twice a year with their doctors, or should they be measuring it at home?
If you are seeing a physician regularly, then it's probably good enough if you're well away from the 130 threshold in a doctor's office to accept the yearly physical type things that are done and the blood pressure measurement there. But a good blood pressure device isn't all that expensive, and it actually is a very reasonable investment. The problem is that when people just go to the store and buy a blood pressure device or order it from Amazon or whatever, they take the thing out of the box, they slap the batteries and put the cuff on and push the button. And one of the difficult things about blood pressure measurement is that it is a slippery variable. You've got to do it right in order to make sense of it. So if you type in targetbp.org, they have a nice graphic that tells you what you need to do. So many things affect the blood pressure measurement, not the blood pressure, but the measurement of blood pressure in an isolated circumstance, that we tell people that there's a certain number of steps you need to follow. They're often not followed in a medical clinic. So don't do what the overworked medical assistant did to you earlier today when you got dragged in, yelled at because you're late, weighed, told you're overweight, and then stick you in a chair and put a blood pressure cuff on you and do a blood pressure right then and there. Of course it's high. That's why we have such a problem with this white coat hypertension that we see. There were 20-25% of people are hypertensive in the office, and they're not outside the office. But when you look at the targetbp.org recommendations, what are you doing? You're trying to emulate what we've done in clinical trials to show the value of treating elevated blood pressure once it's confirmed to be elevated. In order to compare your benefit to the benefit we see in trials, you have to take the blood pressure the way we took it in trials. It takes a few minutes to do that correctly, but if you mess up or shortcut, everything you do to bypass the correct set of steps raises the blood pressure. It gives you a falsely high reading. The most important things are to be seated with your back supported, like this chair behind me, back support. If your back is not supported, your brainstem has a little bit of problem orienting itself, so it's always stressing the muscles a little bit, changing the vascular resistance and altering the blood pressure. Your arm needs to be here, right at heart level, right from the heart. If it's down here, or if it's up there because the cuff happens to be located high on the wall, you're not going to get a correct pressure. This will be too low, that'll be too high. Your legs should be on the floor. This is a problem especially for women having their blood pressure checked when their legs are a little shorter than the distance from the chair to the floor. My wife, for example, she complains about that all the time because there's about a 4-inch gap between the tips of her feet and the bottom of the floor. Feet need to be on the floor, rested, because if the feet are hanging in space, that's another loose end for the brain. Bladder empty, no cigarettes or caffeine, and no exercise or eating within a half hour of the measurement, and you should do 2. Because the first time you inflate a blood pressure cuff on a human being, there's a little thing called the alerting reflex. You're sitting there calmly, and all of a sudden a python is wrapping itself around your arm, and your brain is going, "Warning, Will Robinson," it's telling you there's something happening. And so the first blood pressure, statistically speaking, is a couple points higher than the second or third. That's why we take 2, sometimes 3 for extra credit, and throw out the first one and average the second and third one for that visit. Many people have this alerting type reflex. It's hard to extinguish that despite multiple readings, so we kind of accept that happens, and we're aware of it. But when you do that, and you do that kind of blood pressure a couple times in the morning, a couple times in the evening, and it comes out well less than 120, you're cool, you're golden. And it's a good idea to do it again in 3 months or 6 months. But when it's hovering in the high 120s or early 130s, it behooves you to get a blood pressure cuff and do these on your own. And I'll give you one example, and then I'll move on to the whatever. If you look at the atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease calculator, so you can go online and put ASCVD calculator, and MD Calc or some other website will come up and give you the opportunity to do this. You put in all your stuff, how old you are, your gender assigned at birth, your ethnic, whatever, and you put in your blood pressure, your 126/80 blood pressure. And it asks you, do you take medicines? You say no. And then you press the button and it tells you your next 10 years are likely to see a heart attack, heart failure, stroke, or kidney disease in X% of people when followed over 10 years. So that number that comes back, whether it's 6%, 10%, 20%, whatever it is, you go back to that calculator, you do the same thing again, everything identical, but now you tell it I take medicines. And everything else is the same, but you're now on medicines. And it just raised your probability of having heart disease or some kind of cardiovascular event over the next 10 years by 1 to 2, maybe as high as 3%, depending on your age. How's it come it did that? Because of a problem we call residual risk. And I'll finish with this. In order to treat blood pressure that's elevated in the office, it's got to be elevated in the office, generally on 2 or 3 visits before you commit to therapy. Odds are, Simon, it's been high for a year or 2. And during that year or 2, you built up some degree of minor damage. It's called subclinical damage from the blood pressure. That's why the calculator takes that into account when it spits out a likelihood that you're going to have a cardiovascular event over the next 10 years when you have a number that is a number because you're on medication.
Which comes back to the importance of this conversation for the 35-year-old who maybe doesn't have a problem now. If you develop a problem soon and you're not keeping an eye on blood pressure and you find out you had high blood pressure for 15 years when you're 60, that's 15 years of residual exposure to elevated blood pressure and all of the potential damage that's caused. Back to the ideal reading that you mentioned. You've said a couple times, I think at the top you sort of mentioned the guidelines talk about 115/80. And I suspect a lot of people listening have always heard the old 120/80. So is it now clear to us that 115 is preferable to 120?
Let me say what I said before, perhaps in a little different way. The relationship of blood pressure to outcomes is like this pen. The reason we pick 115 is there's so little data below it that we got to start somewhere. So there's very little data on 110, 100, 90, 80 for the upper number. And the 115 for the upper number, it comes from a large database called the BP Trialists database. Sarah Lewington was the first author on the Lancet article that published this. And it looked at death from heart disease or stroke or whatever. That was a primary outcome. But it also looked at, heart disease, kidney disease, stroke, and that kind of thing. And what it showed is that every time that upper number goes up 20 points, beginning at 115 and going up the ladder there, you double cardiovascular risk. So 115 to 135 doubles, but it's very small at 115. So doubling very small to get to 135 is a small number. But 135 to 155 now takes that less small number and doubles it again. And then 155 to 170 takes a number and then doubles it to a really significant number. So it becomes a statistics kind of issue when it comes to treating high blood pressure. Your biggest benefit is when people were high, like 180, 190 on the upper number, and you get them down to around 120 or 130 if you're fortunate enough to get that much blood pressure reduction with the combination of things that we do currently. But the issue about what's the rock bottom best lower number, I used to say this when asked, especially on camera, 5 points above where you pass out. That's your best blood pressure. Just enough to keep you from passing out. That's your best blood pressure. If your brain can live with that, the rest of you can too. But that's, it's going to be so individualized, it would never make it in a guideline. So it's kind of a snarky answer to the question. But we generally think that below 120 is reasonably healthy for most people. The exception are people with chronic diseases, like people on dialysis, for example. When their blood pressure is down in the 90 to 100 range, often it's because their hearts are damaged from the years of blood pressure and the other tolls that other, what we call comorbidities, like diabetes, have taken on them. It's not always safe to be 110 systolic, but it's generally preferable, especially in your 35-year-old. There, 110 would be absolutely ideal.
So someone comes into the clinic and they get their blood pressure measured a couple of times, or they're doing it at home like you just suggested and walked us through, and their reading comes back high. At what thresholds does the kind of reading suggest that intervention is needed, whether that's lifestyle changes, medication, or both?
Right. So I worked with the Canadians and the guideline systems for Canada. And one of the groups, and they parse it into different groups, and I worked in the measurement and threshold group. And they consider the office blood pressure a screening tool, not the definitive diagnostic method. So unless you're using an automated blood pressure called the BP True or one like it, where you can put a patient in a room, make sure they're seated, feet on the floor, back supported, arm at heart level, bladder empty, all the other things I mentioned, you push a button, you walk out of the room, the machine waits for a little while, then it takes 3 blood pressures without any human in the room, so the patient isn't talking. Talking raises your blood pressure. And then you come back in. So that BP True type of blood pressure reading, which a very small percentage of people in the U.S. actually do in their clinic practices currently, that's reasonably good. But by and large, how we take a blood pressure in most clinics is better thought of as a screening tool, where an out-of-office measurement that's also high would be confirmatory. And the reason we emphasize the value of an out-of-office, whether that's a home blood pressure monitor or wearing an ambulatory monitor that takes your blood pressure automatically over 24 hours, day and night, that those are considered confirmatory tests. And the reason they're valuable is that high blood pressure is a lifelong disease for most people. The two things that change that are dramatic weight loss. So, the Ozempic, Wegovy, Zepbound, those type drugs, they're changing the rules here in terms of blood pressure because people are losing weight with those things. But the other way to lose your blood pressure is to have enough damage to your heart from a big old heart attack in order to knock out the pump. And that's a bad way to lower your blood pressure over time. So the issue with measurement is that it is useful to at least have 1 or 2 times a year when you do that. But it is better outside the office when done well. I think it's more reflective of what the person is experiencing compared to the clinic. The thresholds, what do we do with the information? If someone comes in and their pressure is 180 systolic, you don't usually wait. You may bring them back one day later, but generally you're going to treat someone 180 or higher with medication from the get-go. 160 to 180, you may have a little luxury, and depending on how much nerves of steel you have, you may bring them back later that week just to double check that this wasn't, a bad espresso dose or something like that had a short-term elevation in blood pressure. But when it comes down to the threshold to treat with medicines, most agree that 140 and higher gets medication. 130 and lifestyle. Everybody gets lifestyle. Lifestyle is considered like, it's like air. We should all be breathing it. Lifestyle measures should be used in virtually all hypertensive patients because it is a good idea to lose weight. Most of us have a problem with a little extra weight. And it's a good idea to lower salt when you can. Much of our salt intake is built into the food. It's almost inviolate, but you can at least eliminate the discretionary salt from the salt shaker or, calling out for Chinese 3 times a week and then layering on the soy sauce. That you can avoid. And the issues with physical exercise, alcohol reduction, and better sleep quality, those are usually things that help. But 140 and higher, we treat with meds. We usually offer the opportunity, look, we can revisit the meds if you lose weight, if you reduce if things look good from the lifestyle measure and you're able to do it, we can always revisit that. When you come in at 130 and we're sure you're 130, we usually recommend lifestyle measures unless you've got known coronary disease or bad kidneys or some other thing where a lower blood pressure is probably preferable and you're unlikely to get that, or at least you don't want to wait for 6 months or so until that occurs, and we may treat them with medication, but that's less common. We usually use the lifestyle measures in the 130 to 140 range and meds in the 140 and higher.
I think this is a great place, Raymond, for us to kind of land the plane for today and then come back in the next episode to discuss these interventions, both the lifestyle interventions in some more detail, as well as the different medicines, blood pressure lowering drugs that are available to people. But before we do close it out, was there anything that we missed in today's discussion that you wanted to add to here at the end?
Back to your 35-year-old, it's just, if you wait for symptoms to occur, you've waited too long. One of the things we learned years ago is that it's much better to do what's called primary prevention, so manage the risk factors before a bad thing happens, as opposed to waiting for, okay, let's just watch this for a while. Boom, the heart attack. Boom, the kidney failure. Boom, the stroke. Now you're damaged, and now we're playing catch-up baseball instead of secondary prevention instead of primary. And the benefits in secondary prevention, they're there, but they're not quite as good as the benefits in primary. It's better to have a functioning heart than to have a partially functioning heart and yet a better blood pressure.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.